So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I thought it might be nice to start with a short sitting, and but part of the reason for that, it seems like an appropriate way of segue into talking about the Dhammapada, these ancient teachings, these ancient words of the ancients. And I'm reminded of a story of a king who went one evening to visit the Buddha. And it was late at night, it was dark, and he was told that there was a large gathering of Buddhist monks in these woods where the Buddha was practicing, teaching. And so he went to the edge of that forest, and there he left behind his bodyguards and soldiers, and entered into the woods with his minister, and supposedly undefended, unusual for a mighty, somewhat horrible king, and which he was. And he started walking into these woods, and after a short while he got really spooked because it was completely still. Abnormally quiet, I guess, still in there. And he'd been told to expect a large gathering of monks around the Buddha in this grove of trees, and there was not a sound. And the discourses say that his hair stood on end because he was so afraid there was an ambush. And but then his minister said, I think his minister said that, or they saw a light in the distance, and so the minister led him into the light, and there, by the light, was the Buddha sitting. And then all around the Buddha were these group of monastics sitting and meditating, and sitting in silence, and perhaps waiting for the Buddha's teachings to occur, the Buddha to teach. And this image of the Buddha sitting under a tree at night, outside in a grove of woods, in the woods, with people around that are sitting quietly meditating, for me is a very meaningful image, in that it's an image of simplicity, how little is needed, and how simple the Buddhist spiritual life can be, or the way it was taught. Not much is needed. There's not a lot of books. There's not a lot of rituals and stuff that needs to go with it. It just you can just go into the woods and sit at the foot of a tree, and there, with your own practice, realize the truth. So in that spirit and with that image, perhaps we can sit in silence, meditate for maybe 10 minutes, and then I'll discuss our text together. So good evening again, and many thanks for coming here to this book reading and signing. I never would have imagined so many people would have come. It wasn't it was inconceivable to me. And here there's so many people, and so I'm very kind of appreciative and gratified. It's very nice that you came and celebrate this book that I've just been published. Yes, trouble hearing? Yeah, but is it possible to turn it up a little bit? I should also speak up more. Is that better? Can you hear me now? So if it happens again, speak up, because sometimes my voice drops. So, the Dhammapada is technically a book in the Theravadan tradition of Buddhism, the Buddhism of Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, a little bit Bangladesh, teeny bit in India, you find a little bit in Nepal. It's a Buddhist tradition that kind of basically has survived in that part of the world for well over 2,000 years. And the Dhammapada belongs to that tradition, and it could be argued that it's the most loved sacred text of that tradition of Buddhism. It is one of the first things that many monastics, monks and nuns, will study and learn when they enter into the monastic life. They'll often memorize verses from it and use it as part of their teaching, as part of their own practice. it is often, many of these verses of the Dhammapada then spread out from the monastic environment into the popular culture of many of these countries. And some of these verses are kind of cultural aphorisms or sayings that appear in many different forms in those cultures and those countries. Many people know a lot of these verses. They recognize them. They grew up with them. It's kind of common currency, spiritual currency for many people. People go back and refer to this text for inspiration, for ideas. There's not any developed teachings in the text, but the teachings appear very short and succinct, and so they work very well as quotes and as references and as bases for Dharma talks and teachings. So it can be argued as maybe one of the most loved and best known of the body of sacred literature in the Theravadan tradition, loved by both monastics and by lay people. It's often very accessible. Some of the other sacred texts, like the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, it's a little bit difficult to get into it unless you kind of somehow be initiated or familiar with the teachings. It easily put you to sleep to read some of that. But this is relatively accessible, Dhammapada, for many, many people. As Buddhism has come to the West, to Europe and to America, and to the Americas, it's Dhammapada sometimes is kind of seen as being the quintessential Buddhist sacred text, and it's kind of gone beyond the boundaries of its Theravadan tradition. And many people know about the Dhammapada and will think of it as kind of the sacred text of Buddhism, or kind of as a reference for the practice. And I was first given a copy of Dhammapada by my first Zen teacher. So he thought it was very, very valuable and helpful, and he actually, it was a personal gift to me, but I think he bought 100 copies, and he passed them out to all his students at the San Francisco Zen Center. The canonical or sacred literature of Buddhism is vast. It's amazingly vast. If you started today and was going to read it all, maybe you don't have enough lifetimes. I mean, it's unfathomably vast. However, the Theravadan tradition that this Dhammapada is part of, it's a relatively manageable collection of only about 18,000 discourses. Some of them are quite short, but but if you put them all together into English, you have maybe volumes that would maybe be this big on your shelf. So you can kind of manage it. But then if you get beyond the Theravada into Mahayana, then the shelves get bigger and longer, and it's just amazing how long they can be. And technically, there's no beginning to the Buddhist sacred literature in the way that there's a beginning to the Bible. The book of Genesis is the beginning. So there's no beginning per se. However, I've noticed that many people in the West will often take the beginning of the Dhammapada, the opening verses of Dhammapada, as kind of like have the same function as the opening of Genesis. So it's kind of, if you want to look for a beginning, kind of conventionally, some people will take, this is the beginning. This is where it all starts, the Buddhist sacred literature in this text, especially the first two verses. So I'd like to read you the first two verses. Now that I've kind of built up perhaps a sense of importance that these verses have. The verses are difficult to translate because of one word. And the word in Pali is Dhamma, and which in English some of us know it as Dharma, Greg and Dharma. I think, isn't that in the TV show? And so Dharma. And Dharma turns out has a lot of different meanings in Dhamma in Pali and Sanskrit. And so the question is, which meaning of the one traditional dictionary gives 54 definitions for the word Dhamma. So which of those 54 definitions or other meanings should you translate the word Dhamma? And I've translated here as experience. It might be the most controversial thing I did in the whole book. So I'm hoping that people don't get to that second word in the translation and say, forget this book. Though I do explain in a footnote why I chose this word and why I thought it was the best word. There are many other possible choices, but many of them are difficult, have difficulties in their own right. And so it's actually very difficult. Maybe it shouldn't have been translated at all. But I translated here as experience. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows like a never departing shadow. So here the emphasis is put on the creative power of the human mind. That somehow it all begins with the mind. It's led by the mind, made by the mind, preceded by mind. The mind is at the beginning. In the beginning, there was the mind. And whereas in the book of Genesis, it starts with God and the activities of God. And so it's quite, just very interesting to hold these two beginnings of next to each other, and see that the context, the view of the religious life, the starting point is very different in a theistic religion, perhaps, and then here in Buddhism, which in a sense, in a certain kind of unusual way, is considered atheistic religion. But here the mind is considered to be preeminent, very important. And what's saying here is that in using the word experience is not the same thing as events. It doesn't say all events are preceded by mind. Experience, what I'm trying to say here, is that the way that we perceive are the events of life. The way we experience is through the medium of perception, interpretation, understanding, and the idea of so that interface between the creative ability of the mind to think and interpret, and the events of the world is what I'm calling here experience. And so that particular thing is somehow, the mind has a very, very important role in defining, interpreting, naming, shaping what our experience of the world is like. So it says that about the mind, and then it gives a little kind of example. If you speak or act with a corrupted mind, suffering will follow, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. Now, the image of an ox pulling a cart with the wagon wheel is one of, you can maybe a little bit of imagination. It's really a burden. The ox is burdened by this heavy cart. It's struggling and pulling and sweating and snorting, and then it's pulling this cart, and the cart is heavy, and the wagon wheel of the cart follows because it's yoked, it's bound, it's tied up with the cart. It follows along. It's heavy work to bring this along. So speak or act with a corrupted mind, then suffering follows. And it's heavy. Suffering is a burden. It's something that keeps us entangled or entwined, yoked. And then it gives the example on the other end. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows like a never departing shadow. And here, the image of a never departing shadow. A shadow has no weight. No one's burdened by the shadow they bring along with them. It's just right there. It's light. It's it's not even, you can't even say it's light, right? Just the shadows have weight, and so it's something that's not a burden. Doesn't interfere. Doesn't hold us back. There's no drag. So happiness occurs to us in a very light, free, open way. Speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows like a never-departing shadow. So here there's a dichotomy between what we do with our mind. Act with a corrupted mind, certain things follow. Act with a peaceful mind, and there's another thing that follows in the wake of that. So here, emphasis is placed on the mind, what we do with the mind, the creative potential of the mind, and suggesting that we start being the caretaker of the quality of our mind. And if we want to be careful with our mind, the kind of mind we speak from, the kind of mind we act from, and how we act and how we speak has consequences. And then the text wants to gives kind of some more examples of this. Quote, maybe some of you are better at acting this out, but he abused me, he attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. Oh no. For those carrying on like this, hatred does not end. She abused me, attacked me, defeated me, robbed me. For those not carrying on like this, hatred ends. Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hate alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. So here again, we have a verse that's quoted many, many times, over and over again. Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hate alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. So here, hatred is a form of suffering, and it just, the problems in our life. If we live complaining and about life, complaining about things, then our hatred doesn't end. But if we can learn just to refrain from hating, to have certain equanimity and peace, and certain kind of patience, a certain kind of forbearance, then hatred can come to an end, is what the suggestion here is. So here again, it's watching our own mind, watching our reactions, trying to live in a way, taking responsibility for the quality of our mind, which is emphasized here. And this you see throughout the text, the emphasis on taking responsibility for our own mind. There's a lot of discussion about training the mind, restraining the mind, calming the mind, making the mind peaceful. Just like a carpenter straightens wood, an irrigator straightens out the irrigation channels. And a Fletcher straightens the arrows. Fletcher's an arrow maker. So a sage, a wise person, straightens her mind. So it makes it straight. So you have to do something. You take responsibility for your mind. You don't leave the state of your mind to chance, but you engage in it. And what you see through the text, or what the text then presents, is an uncompromising teaching of personal self-reliance. Uncompromising teaching of taking of self-reliance, self-responsibility, and personal liberation, becoming liberated. And I know of no other sacred text in the history of humanity that has the same kind of dramatic emphasis on self-reliance. The Theravadan tradition, out of which this tradition comes from, is sometimes criticized for teaching a spiritual path which is selfish by the other people who don't follow this tradition. And I don't think it's a selfish tradition at all. But this kind of emphasis on personal self-reliance maybe can be seen then. Personal liberation kind of be seen as, oh, you're so caught up in your own practice and your own mind and what's going on. The image the tradition gives in response to this is that of two people who are stuck in quicksand. And if one of them, out of great compassion, tries to pull the other one out, the one doing the pulling is going to sink further into the quicksand. And then the other one tries to pull, and it's like a seesaw, they both go sink. One of them has to get up onto the dry land, and then from the dry land can pull the others out. So there's something to be said about, getting out of the quicksand. Something to be said about, as you say in the airlines, put the air mask on yourself first before you put it on the children, because otherwise you can't maybe get a chance to. So there's something to be said about taking care of oneself and being responsible for oneself and purifying oneself to some degree, so we can be a greater help to the world around us. So here, this text puts a lot of emphasis on personal practice. To get a little bit of sense of the urgency that the text puts on this, the next quote goes like this, next verse. Many do not realize that we here must die. Well, I guess you all realize that, don't you? Yeah. But do you really realize that? Really realize that? Some of you, people with gray hair are nodding. But I've known plenty of people, including myself, for whom I knew I was going to die. It was a pretty clear thing. But it just seemed like it was there in the mythic future. And it didn't really have any impact on my life and how I lived my life and what I was doing. And I've known people who have encountered death in a very dramatic way because of some diagnosis or a friend who dies or something. And they realize, wait a minute. And they develop a sense of spiritual urgency that this is, you don't know how much time you have. And let's get serious here about this life of ours. And there's a lot of ways in which we can live our life in complacent ways or lazy ways or kind of postponing ways, procrastinating. So here is a very emphatic statement. Many do not realize we here must die. The way I read this text, the way I understand it as I read it, is that whoever brought these verses together had a sense of urgency, had a sense of human life is quite precious, the time we have is precious, and let's just get really down to what's essential right away. Let's get to the point, and let's not, get sidetracked from some really important work that can be done. And so you find a verse here, the same chapter. It's a little bit funny verse, but those who consider the inessential to be essential and see the essential as inessential don't reach the essential, living in the field of wrong intention. Those who know the essential to be essential and the inessential as inessential reach the essential, living in the field of right intention. So to know what's essential, and what's the deepest intention of our hearts, what's the most important thing to do with a human life, is the question that I see when I read this text here, because that text challenges me as I read it. In the first chapter, as it talks about the importance of the mind and caretaking the mind, cultivating the mind, living with a mind that's pure or peaceful rather than one that's corrupted, it talks over and over again that the benefits of a peaceful mind or a purified mind is happiness either in this life or happiness in future lives. The results, the consequences of a corrupted mind, a hateful mind, for example, is unhappiness in this lifetime and unhappiness in future lifetimes. Until you get to the last two verses of the chapter. One who recites many teachings. So this, I pay attention to this, right? One who recites many teachings, but being negligent, doesn't act accordingly, like a cowherd counting others' cows, does not attain the benefit of the contemplative life, of the spiritual life. Have you counted other people's cows? One who recites but a few teachings, yet lives according to the Dharma, abandoning passion, ill will, and delusion, aware and with mind well freed, not clinging in this life or the next, attains the benefits of the contemplative life. So here the shift has been from attaining happiness in this life and future lives to beginning to talk about a whole different goal of the spiritual life, which is liberation, freedom. The benefits of contemplative life here is meant to be the benefits of liberation itself. Freedom from here it says passion, ill will, and delusion. Aware and with mind well freed. And that little expression, aware and with mind well freed. I love that. It speaks something about something really precious, something really beautiful, a tremendous jewel, this invisible jewel that we all have. The capacity of the mind to be awake, aware, and freed. A mind that's free doesn't have any preoccupations, it doesn't have any constrictions, it's not driven by fear, it's not driven by hate, not driven by ambition, confusion. So the mind has been freed and awake and aware. This is the kind of the goal, which is called the ultimate goal, or the absolute goal. The goal of happiness in this life is considered a conventional goal. And it's nice to have that, but it's not what the Buddha was really pointing to. He taught a path. He taught how to cultivate conventional happiness in life. But what he was really interested in was how to liberate the mind or the heart, how to free it. That freedom of mind, the mind that's aware and well-freed, awake and well-freed, is sometimes referred to or connected to what is called the deathless state, the deathless dimension. And maybe it seems like a strange expression, the deathless, many of us. In my own mind, I think it's an inadequate connection to the word deathless. It's kind of diminishes a little bit. But to get a little flavor of the deathless, I like the English expression, the timeless. If some of you have ever been present in such a way you felt that the moment was timeless, the deathless maybe has a little bit of that quality of the timeless present. Vigilance is the path to the deathless. Negligence, the path to death. The vigilant do not die. The negligent are as if already dead. Now, so when I read this, I read a very powerful verse. Some people translate Dhammapada as heedfulness. Some people as diligence. Some people as mindfulness, constant mindfulness, energetic mindfulness. I translate it as vigilance. Vigilance is the path to the deathless. Negligence is the path to death. The vigilant do not die. That's quite a promise. The negligent are as if already dead. Or the mindless are as already dead. If you really want to feel life or be alive, you need to be awake and aware. If you're lost in your thoughts and hardly even know, have you ever been driving in your car and realized 2 exits beyond that you missed your exit? Were you alive then? Where were you? Right. And this sense of urgency in the text also translates to emphasis on energetic effort, vigilant effort, making really. There's nothing here about take your time, relax, just accept the present moment. Everything will be fine. Everything is perfect. These people are serious people. This is a serious teaching. Get serious and apply yourself, because who knows when you'll have the chance again. So they have a lot of words, like energetic words, effort, vigilance, energy, appear over and over again. Absorbed in meditation, persevering, always steadfast, the wise touch nirvana, the ultimate rest from toil. And that's an interesting juxtaposition. This emphasis here is on persevering, always steadfast. That's the path. And what that leads to is the ultimate rest from toil, from the work, from the efforts. So there's a contrast between the work of being on the path and then the results of that work, which is, here it's called a rest from toil, but which is a phenomenal experience of peace, of well-being. One of the flavors for me as I read this text that comes through regularly is that idea of peace. having a heart, having a being that's deeply at peace, at rest, not in conflict with anything in the world. Now, since the mind is so important in all this, it's important to understand something about the mind. Restless, agitated, the restless, agitated mind, hard to protect, hard to control, the sage makes straight as a fletcher the shaft of an arrow. Like a fish out of water thrown on dry ground, this mind trashes about, trying to escape Mara's command. You ever feel your mind is trashing about like a fish out of water? Yeah? Trying to escape Mara's command. Mara is the personification of all the forces of the mind which deaden the mind, which somehow bring about suffering, torment the mind. There's a beautiful book recently published called Destructive Emotions. That book is all about Mara. The mind, hard to control, flighty, alighting where it wishes, one does well to tame. The disciplined mind brings happiness. The mind, hard to see, subtle, alighting where it wishes, the sage protects. The watched mind brings happiness. Some of the verses in the text, as you listen to them, don't have to be Buddhist. In fact, scholars believe that some of the verses in Dhammapada originated outside of Buddhism. They were kind of current at the time of the Buddha, or preceded the Buddha, even in India. They were part of poems that already existed or songs that existed at the time, and that they were taken by the Buddha or by early Buddhists and incorporated into the Buddhist texts. And so you listen to some of these, and some of these are just wisdom teachings that any spiritual tradition might speak. Here's one. Whatever an enemy may do to an enemy, or haters one to another, far worse is the harm from one's own wrongly directed mind. That's quite a statement about the power of your own mind. Neither mother nor father nor any other relative can do one as much good as one's own well-directed mind. Here's another wisdom teaching. Do not many traditions say almost the same thing. Do not consider the faults of others or what they have or haven't done. Consider rather what you yourself have or haven't done. Some of you know that one of my favorite, I have a lot of favorite verses in here, but one of them is the one that goes something like, I don't know where it is right now, but something like, they'll criticize you if you speak a lot. They'll criticize you if you don't speak at all. And they'll criticize you if you speak in moderation. There's no one who's free from criticism. Now I read that and I start feeling more equanimous very quickly. What can you do? You do the best you can and you'll get criticized, and that's the way it goes. Irrigators guide water, fletchers shape arrows, carpenters fashion wood, sages tame themselves. As a solid mass of rock is not moved by the wind, so a sage is not moved by praise or blame. As a deep lake is clear and undisturbed, so a sage becomes clear upon hearing the Dharma. For a person who, like the earth, is untroubled, who is well practiced, who is like a pillar of Indra, who is like a lake without mud, there is no more wandering. A pillar of Indra was a huge pillar that they bury at the entrance of a city, and it buried, as much of it buried underground as above ground. So it was really tall, and so you couldn't move it. It was really unshakable. So that kind of stability and grounding and rootedness was someone who's liberated. Well, here's a nice one. I like this one, of describing an enlightened person. Like the path of birds in the sky, it is hard to trace the path of those who do not hoard, who are judicious with their food, and whose field is the freedom of emptiness and signlessness. Like the path of birds in the sky, it is hard to trace the path of those who have destroyed their toxins, their destructive emotions, and whose field is the freedom of emptiness and signlessness. So there's something untraceable about an enlightened person. You can't find their path. You can't find. There's something something that can't be seen about them. And their field, the field they abide in, the dimension they live in, is somehow characterized, a certain kind of freedom that's characterized by emptiness and signlessness. There's a whole teaching in itself what that means. But so this is a very famous quote that, again, talks about this emphasis on your own efforts. It is up to you to make strong effort. Buddhas merely tell you how. So now I want to read you. So I like this text a lot. However, that's how to say this. Maybe I should say it differently. I love the text. I don't necessarily always like it. It's like, being in an intimate relationship with someone, and you love them, but there are these difficulties. So, this text, I find it also challenging. Sometimes I don't know if I like some of the verses, or I don't know what it's about. I believe that the text was meant to challenge these people who felt it was the sense of urgency and don't waste time and apply yourself and do what's essential. They're kind of like the text is offering a challenge, challenging us to practice, but also challenging some of our most cherished beliefs, cherished ideas and identities and attachments. And so some of the text, if you don't feel challenged by a text, then the text is not doing its work. If it's just kind of very nice and poetic and inspiring and feel really good by the time we finished, then I think from the point of view of the people who compiled this text, the text has failed. Some of it certainly can be inspiring, but I think it's really meant to be a challenging text. Some of the English translations that exist are not translations at all, but renditions. Some of the most popularly sold books in English of the Dhammapada, the people didn't know any Pali at all, but they looked at existing English translations and then came with their own. And one of them, I think one of the most best-selling ones out there, I think is really beautiful, and I'm inspired when I read it. But I know that it's not the teachings of the Buddha. And so, one of the things I tried to do in translating this text is to the best that it was possible, I really wanted to hear the voices, the original voices, the original teachings. I didn't want my preferences to get in the way. And it's hard to kind of avoid that entirely. But I really wanted to try the best I could out of respect for those ancient Buddhists who are our ancestors in a sense. I really wanted their voices to come forth and speak for themselves. And if I didn't like what the verse said, I wasn't going to twist it so I liked it. I really wanted to kind of let it come up. So the text is to challenge us. So here are some challenging verses. Having killed mother, father, 2 warrior kings, a kingdom and its subjects, the Brahmin, undisturbed, moves on. Here the Brahmin is supposed to mean synonymous with the person who's enlightened. Well, that's what it takes. But then to say that again, it says, having killed mother, father, 2 learned kings, and a tiger, the Brahmin, undisturbed, moves on. Well, what's a tiger doing there? Right? These are metaphors. So you have to understand it in that way. But first, hit this. Gee, what's that about? So each of these are symbolic for something else. And I think that it's great to have footnotes, because then you find out what you know. If it's your footnotes, I guess. Mother, so according to the commentaries, mother refers to craving and father to conceit. 2 warrior kings to the metaphysical views of eternalism and annihilationism. The kingdom to the 12 sense spheres, and the subjects of the kingdom to the passion for pleasure. And the tiger has some kind of reference to the 5 hindrances. Then there's one verse that... So I told you how I tried to be literal best I could and try to capture. Well, there's one verse that, if I can... Here it is. So... this is what the verse literally says. And I put it in the literal translation. In the endnotes. Tucked away, it's kind of small print. The person who is without faith and gratitude, who breaks into homes, who has destroyed opportunities, and who has vomited, is an audacious person, or perhaps is the ultimate servant. What's that about? Strange language. This is how I translated it. The person who has gone beyond faith, knows the unmade, has severed the link, destroyed the potential for rebirth, and eliminated clinging, is the ultimate person. What do you think of that? Have I just done one of those kind of, modern American things of making it kind of nice? Because it didn't quite fit my view of things, and Buddha couldn't have said that. And certainly the Buddha was, he was probably, from California, right? So I'm sure he meant that. It's verse 97. Now the thing about this translation is that this particular verse was made up of puns, word puns, and so because of the word pun, you can translate it either way. And I think it was meant to, again, be challenging or shocking to the person when they first heard it. What? Breaking into homes? Vomiting? What's that about? But it's a wordplay, so I debated a lot which to put it in the body of the text. When you do play the wordplay, which direction to take it, and partly with advice from others, I was convinced to put the most literal meaning in the footnotes and the wordplay kind of meaning in the body of the text. So I think the text is meant to be challenging. And here's a challenging verse. At least maybe it's challenging. Some people will read this text and come to the conclusion that it's world denying, world negating. It's reasonable to come to that conclusion because some of the English translations translate it that way. And I think, now we can debate forever about who's right here, right? But I think that many people who translate into English along those lines, it's their own bias that comes through, not the original. But even so, here's one that could be seen as being world denying or negating. Do not follow an inferior way. Don't live with negligence. Do not follow a wrong view. Don't be engrossed in the world. Don't be engrossed in the world. That could sound like somehow, don't be involved with the world. But engrossed is meant to be a strong word. Engrossed means somehow captivated by the world, or enchanted by the world, or infatuated, or lost in the world in the way that people can be. So don't get lost in the world, is what it says here. But that can, some people will kind of be startled by that. Don't be engrossed in the world. But then there's this one. Affection gives rise to grief. Affection gives rise to fear. For someone released from affection, there is no grief. And from where would come fear? What do you think of that? What's wrong with affection? Isn't that disturbing? So again, the text is challenging us. So okay, so you could just throw away the book now, get your money back, and say, that's not for me. What's this negating the value of affection? It's so basic to human life. And now I'm convinced these Buddhists are world denying. They're kind of these celibate monks who are uptight and kind of. And affection gives rise to grief. For someone released from affection, who wants that? So part of the opportunity in a text like this is to grapple with that. And I think part of the function of a good spiritual text is a text that we have to grapple with, that we have to struggle with. And it doesn't give easy answers always, but rather, what's going on and why does it say this? Do we just dismiss it offhand, or do we engage it and debate with our friends about what it says there? So I've done that for this verse. And I could tell you who won the debate, or I could leave it to you to do the debate on your own. So the text has a lot of verses which are not developed teachings, but are very kind of pithy kind of challenges to think about, or think about things in a new way. Here's another one. If, by giving up a lesser happiness, one could experience greater happiness, a wise person would renounce the lesser to behold the greater. I find that a very interesting teaching. And I spent a lot of time reflecting on that particular verse. What does that mean? Is that really true? And what's that about? And what's this pursuit of happiness all about? And, going from one happiness to a better one, is that hedonistic? These Buddhist hedonists? Just going for happiness? So, I could certainly give whole teachings, a lot of interpretations of this, but maybe it's better just to leave it hanging. And you guys, this is an example of a verse that is to be engaged with. And so, I've spent whole days, with one verse kind of going through my mind and reflecting on it, thinking about it, and living with it. It comes back at different times because I'm familiar now with this text. The verses come back into my mind at different times, and I feel my life has been enriched by having these verses bubble up in my mind and offer a different perspective or idea. Sometimes I'll just pick up the book and just see what hits my eye, what verses hit my eye, and what that speaks to me for any given day. And one of the interesting things about translating the text is that you translate it verse by verse, and each verse, kind of lost in the world of each verse, kind of. And it wasn't until I finished it that I started to have an overall view of the whole text. And even more so once the publisher sent me the copy of the book. And because somehow in the book form, I felt I could get an overview in a way I couldn't when I was there verse by verse. And so I still find it very interesting. It's still opening up for me and interesting for me to look and read it. A few more things I'll say is that not only is this book unique, or almost unique, in its kind of uncompromising message of self-reliance, it also seems to me pretty unique in the history, in the collection of sacred literature in the world, to be metaphysically light. There's almost no metaphysics. Or some people could argue none, or I think there's a little bit, but almost none. The metaphysics seems almost not necessary as you read this. And you look at the chapter titles. Just looking at titles already begins telling you something about what the emphasis is. Vigilance, the mind, the fool, the sage, the arhat, evil, violence, old age, oneself, the world, the Buddha, happiness, the deer, anger, corruption, the just, the path, the elephant, craving, the bhikkhu, the Brahman. Kind of gives you, it's not talking about cosmic consciousness or some metaphysical principles. It's talking about something that's very basic, very pretty basic, pretty immediate, something we can experience, something that's part of our ordinary life. I think this is not a message that takes us. I think it takes us out of our life into some reality outside. But for me, it's a message that takes us into a capacity for very, very deep peace, very deep sense of deep peace, well-being, freedom of heart, freedom of mind. That I hope is contagious. That I hope is something that spreads out to others. And that freedom that this text that is pointing to is basically never talked about in affirmative ways or positive ways. It doesn't describe what that is like, except that it's freedom. How it describes, what the descriptions of it are over and over again in negative terms. What you're freed from, because if you need freedom, it means that you're enslaved or in prison or in shackles or something, right? And so it talks about being freed from those shackles or freed from those prisons. And so the kind of prisons that or shackles that the text emphasizes is free of death, which is a very interesting thing. Why does it say that? And certainly the Buddha died, so how could he have said free from death? Free from bonds, fetters or shackles, from conceit, from craving, from fear, from obsessive thinking, from the toxins, the toxic emotions, from suffering, and from mental defilements. And then you might ask, why this emphasis on defining freedom from what is lacking, what's absent? And I argue in the introduction that for two basic reasons. One is that maybe freedom, the experience of liberation, cannot be described through a normal language and normal words. And so it's better not to try to talk about what you can't talk about. Perhaps if you try to say what it is, then people will latch onto it, that idea. So if you don't tell them what it is, then it's harder to latch on, to get attached. But also maybe, and this is, again, I don't know if this is true, but it's something to reflect. Maybe freedom is not one thing. As when someone is, if two people are released from prison on the same day, their experience of the doors opening up and stepping free from the prison is the same. But what they do with that freedom can be widely different from each other. The experience of freedom, once they have it, can be very different depending on what they do. So in the same way, when we have stepped out of those things that keep our hearts, our minds bound by fear, by hatred, by confusion, by ambition, by obsessive thinking, and we step into that empty field, the signless field of freedom, it's up to us how we live our lives. And we can live it in many different ways, each of us in our own ways. But we live then with freedom. And it's my belief that one of the greatest gifts we can give the world is that freedom. And my hope is that it's contagious. So that's some thoughts about the text. Maybe if you have a few questions you'd like to ask before we stop, and I can sign some books if you'd like. Any questions? Comments? Protests?
I wonder if you could say more about why you chose the word instead of diligence.
Well, why did I choose the word vigilance instead of other choices for the word appamada? Actually, for a long time I had translated it as attentiveness. I really like that. But in the end I was convinced that it wasn't really right for the word appamada. The reason I like attentiveness is that it's very close to the word attention, and somehow attention is the path to the deathless, something about the nature of attention or awareness in and of itself. But the meaning of the word is a certain kind of heightened watchfulness, heightened alertness. Vigilance works for that. You're vigilant, you're being attentive. There's a danger, and so you're vigilant, you're careful. So heedful is another word. Someone who is pamada, someone who is, I translate, there's two words, there's pamada, which means heedless or negligent, and lacking that kind of, and there's appamada, which is vigilant. And it just seemed to me that vigilance had just the right balance of awareness, alertness, watchfulness, mindfulness, and also a sense of energy, being energetic in that endeavor, and also a sense of urgency. And I felt that captured the spirit of this text the best.
In the notes you referred to, I'm not sure I pronounced the name wrong, where you abbreviate the DHTA as traditional commentary. What is that relative to the Dhammapada? Is it written later?
Oh, yes.
What
Oh, yeah. So Dhammapada, we don't know exactly when it was compiled. Sometimes it's claimed that these are the words of the Buddha, and chances are most of them are, but I don't think we can say that they all are. In fact, there's no internal evidence. The majority of the verses, there's no evidence that they were spoken by the Buddha. The tradition claims it is, but there is evidence that some of the verses were probably spoken by other people. There is evidence for that, and so I talked about that a little bit in the end notes, I think. And so sometime, probably could have been during the time of the Buddha's life, or maybe after he died, there was interest in beginning to making these anthologies of verses. And there are many people who did that, because there's a genre of literature called the Dhammapada genre. It's a collection, and use a Sanskrit word, Dhammapada, that are, there's other collections like this of Buddhist verses. Some of them are a lot longer, like one of them has about 1,000 verses. They share a lot of the same verses, but then some of the collections have other verses in them, and the arrangement is different, how they're arranged within, the first verses in this text happen, halfway through the other collection. This is the only one that survives in Pali. There's some that survive in other languages, Tibetan, Chinese, Gandhari, Sanskrit, different things. And no one knows which one is the original one, but the assumption is that they're all influencing each other. And so the text, the original, no one knows what it is. But by the time these were written down and codified, it already represents a developed tradition. At some point, probably about anywhere between 500 and 1,000 years after the time of the Buddha, people started making commentaries about this text. And there's two kinds of commentaries that I know of. One is kind of a word-by-word commentary that actually talks about the words, what they mean. And some of the words are very hard to understand what some of the words mean. And so they kind of explain the words and the meaning. And they help to some degree. However, sometimes because they're a later Buddhist tradition, some of the orthodox later ideas are interpreted back into the text. So you have to be a little cautious when you read the commentary. And then the other kind of commentary is, and it's not exactly a commentary, but they'll give one verse, and then they'll tell the story for when the Buddha taught that verse. And every verse has a story of when the Buddha said that verse. And these are apocryphal stories. They were made up probably 1,000 years after the Buddha. But they're supposed to illustrate why this verse came to be. And so there's those two kinds of commentary, and both commentaries have been translated into English.
Gil, I'm interested in how you learn Pali. Did you, would you like to tell us how, I mean, was it an academic pursuit at Stanford, or did you do it in Southeast Asia, or both? I just think it must have taken years and years to be able to make these discriminations between already existing translations and...
I studied Sanskrit at the university. I studied it in graduate school, and I didn't study a lot of it, so I didn't become fluent, for example. But I got the basics of the grammar of Sanskrit. And Pali is a simplified form of Sanskrit. If you know Sanskrit, it's relatively easy to read Pali. If you know Pali, it's hard to read Sanskrit because of that direction. It's kind of like, maybe it's not completely the same, but if you have, Latin, and then you have Italian, it's like the languages evolve over time. So Pali can be seen as a simplified form of Sanskrit. So I studied Sanskrit, and then, and so I knew the grammar, I knew kind of the structure of the language a little bit, enough. And then I had to rely a lot on dictionaries. So it wasn't. I tried to be really careful. So it was a really slow process to do this because I'm not fluent. I don't have the history of knowing Pali well enough. And ideally you would have read lots and lots of Pali texts and lots of the originals for years, and before you are so presumptuous as to translate. But I jumped in, and so I had to use the dictionary a lot, and I had to use my understanding of the grammar. I had to go back to the grammar book sometimes to understand the subtleties that existed. There were times which I had to ask other people for help, and I asked other people who knew Pali a lot better than me for help. My goal was to do a translation that would not rise the eyebrows of any Pali scholar. So, what I know now is 4 people who know Pali well have looked at it, and as far as I know, I've seen no eyebrows go up. So that was what?
Even about experience.
Yeah, I think Tanjef, who many of you know, Tanisar Bhikkhu, I think he wasn't so happy with it, but he didn't veto it. There were other things in the translation which he felt much stronger about that I should change. And I would listen to him, and we would have these debates. And sometimes I listened to him, and sometimes I thought he was wrong. And once, he has a translation also. That's pretty good. And but I was very pleased that once, in one verse, he went back and changed his after seeing mine. And I did the translation basically, one verse at a time. And what happened was that I was kind of prompted to do it by the publisher. I wasn't thinking of doing it. I mean, they kind of were asking for someone to do it, and I said, well, I should look at. I wasn't thinking of doing it, but I'll just look at look at it, and I'll look at the Pali. And I started one evening, kind of just translating, and it was kind of fun to translate. That was kind of nice, and so I kept it up a little bit. And then it was a time when my first son was very hard to put to sleep at night, and so he required someone to kind of be with him until he fell asleep, and it took a long time. It was a trip. And primarily my wife would do that, and she would often fall asleep with him. So I had all these evenings. And you do 1 or 2 verses in the evening, and you have a lot of evenings. Eventually you finish. So that's how it came to be. Yes?
I do translations too, and I know how very difficult it is. And there's a saying, the Italians say, tradutore, which means translator, traitor. And I feel that you haven't been a traitor to this text, and it just reads beautifully, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, I try to be honest in the sense that if there were any questions or controversy or about how I translated, I tried to say that in the endnotes. So I'm not trying to do a fast one over the reader. People who know, if there's a question, go to the endnotes and there's some explanation there. If minimum, I'll give the Pali, so you can go and get your Pali dictionary. Yes.
What is the proper pronunciation of the title and why aren't we using it?
Dhammapada?
Because Richard Sackett says it's Dhammapada.
Yeah, someone said there are different ways of pronouncing Pali depending on which country you're in. So it could be a difference like that, and so my understanding is Dhammapada, but yeah, it has to be Dhammapada. Because it's two words. It's Dhamma and Pada, and so you would pronounce it Dhamma Pada. I don't think the compound changes the way the syllables are broken up. Yeah.
What is a rendition? I never heard.
Oh, a rendition.
Rendition versus translation.
Yeah, translation is where you go back to the original and you're translating directly from the. Rendition is a creative rendering, like. Timothy Leary, he did a rendition of the Tao Te Ching. It was called something like the psychedelic Tao Te Ching or something. And what he did was he went and got half a dozen English translations of Tao Te Ching, went to Nepal, would read like one chapter or one verse or something, and drop acid. And then he would make his rendition. And so it's kind of like doing jazz off it. You kind of just rip. And so sometimes people take a lot of creative license. And so the one that I like actually a lot is the one by Thomas Byron. And I think it's actually quite beautiful. The way he's done a great job, but and it's elegant, and I'm inspired by some of the things I read there. But there's no way that's what the Buddha taught. I mean, it's sometimes it's kind of close, sometimes it's wildly off. I don't know what he was on. But I don't think he knew Pali. I think he found an English translation and was somehow found his inspiration as a poet and kind of worked off it to do something new. So.
I feel like we should be yelling sadhu or something.
Thank you. Well, it would be nice if some of you, would read it, and if you found it meaningful, or at least found it a worthy debater, worthy opponent, where you can worthy place to be challenged. And I don't know who will win your debate, but you find it worthy to have engaged in debate with the text and the teachings of the text, and that it's a worthy thing to do. So many thanks for coming. I feel honored that you've come to this little inauguration of the text, and I'm happy to sign copies if people have copies. And I had no idea. We had no idea so many people were going to come. I didn't, at least. So I actually talked Inez into getting fewer copies. I couldn't believe that it was. So I don't know if there's any more back there, but I apologize for. What? There's 5. So thank you very much.